Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, January 12th, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about the United States Senate race in the state of Maryland, a state that is typically Democratic, that more recently elected a Republican governor in the 2018 governor election, that governor being Larry Hogan, one of the most popular governors across the United States, who in recent polling data touts a 68% approval rating across the state. In a solid blue state, this Republican governor is extremely adored and liked, and it says even in the headline that everybody loves Larry. And with this popularity, it seems as if the National Republican Party, not necessarily the statewide GOP, because there is a bit of contention there between the statewide GOP and the governor of the state, but the National Republican Party is pushing Larry Hogan to run for Senate in the state of Maryland in the 2022 midterm elections. Now, why would they do this? I actually made a video talking about how Larry Hogan might run for Senate all the way back in October of 2021. And at that point in time, we were talking about how Maryland was just inherently a blue state. We went through a bunch of different points about the last time there was actually a competitive Senate race in 2006, but the Democratic wave carried the Democrats over the finish line. And we talked about how Maryland just inherently is a blue state. Republicans haven't been able to win Maryland, I think, since 1988. So seeing it consistently blue, and I'm actually going to check the 1988 remark that I just made and see the last time it actually went red. Yes, 1988 was the last time Maryland voted red, and even then it wasn't even by a substantial margin, 2.9% against Michael Dukakis there. But the point is that Maryland has remained a blue state, and the Republican Party has been pressuring Hogan to run, but he realistically has no chance at victory. But I talked about that all in my October video, and if you watched it, I'm sure you don't want to see this again. If you haven't watched it, well, I'm sure you can go ahead and check it out if you want to, or, really what you need to take away with it is the fact that Maryland is a blue state, and there really isn't much of a difference there. In terms of now versus 2020, Maryland didn't have a rapid expansion towards the right. There's not some growing and booming metro area that can expand the Republican Party's vote share in the state. The state of Maryland is exactly where it was a year ago. So seeing this pressure from the GOP, we're going to talk about why this actually might be. And rather than talk about the electability of Larry Hogan, we're more so going to talk about what this pressure actually could tell us about what the strategy is. Because anybody who is working close to Mitch McConnell, anybody who is working to Rick Scott, the chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, the committee that is solely focused on electing and re-electing Republicans across the country in the United States Senate, anyone close to them will tell them Maryland is not a winnable state. They've seen the presidential election results from the last election. They've seen that Joe Biden has been able to win Maryland by over 30 percentage points, the largest margin of victory for a Democrat in Maryland in decades. Right? County flips that haven't flipped in decades. Some of them half a century they've been red, and they flipped for Joe Biden. So to assume that Hogan could have any chance at some type of victory on a nationalized race is wrong. But there is a strategy here, or at least maybe I'm reading too deep into it, but the strategy could end up playing out whether the Republicans like it or not, because it does benefit them. This reminds me a lot of what Democrats tried to do in previous Senate races, whether they were doing it intentionally or not. I mean, looking at the 2020 Senate elections, here was our map. But this map doesn't tell the full story. A lot of these states you could have guessed maybe 6 years prior to this election following 2014 how many of the races were going to go. Had you asked me, even in 2016, is Kansas going to be competitive in 2020? I would have said no, make it solid red. And while the Republicans did end up winning it, it was an extremely expensive race. Same thing in the state of Montana. Same thing in the state of Kentucky, in South Carolina, all races that Democrats seem to heavily target, at least with their pocketbooks, that didn't end up being too competitive because we knew how they were going to go. They never really should have been characterized for the Democratic Party, but they were forcing the Republican Party to counteract their spending by raising a lot of money and spending it on a race that was never going to be competitive. And that's the thing. You can actually see this in the Baltimore Sun. They mentioned this right at the end, where they say that this actually might just be a method of the Republican Party forcing the Democratic Party to spend money on a race that would otherwise be safe. Saying right here, literally what I just said, it would force Democrats to devote money and other resources in a longtime blue state at a time when they're already bracing for a difficult campaign season across the country. And that is entirely true. Looking at the 2022 Senate races that we are working with, the Democratic Party is already on defense. They're playing defense in Georgia. They're playing defense in New Hampshire. They're playing defense in Arizona. They're playing defense in Nevada. 4 states that are traditionally competitive and are competitive for 2022. The Republican Party just needs one of those seats in order to win back control. And if Democrats are already going to devote hundreds of millions of dollars across those 4 races, that's a good sign, at least for the 4 races, that those are the sole and only priorities. But if Republicans introduce a problem in a state such as Maryland, then Democrats might have to devote resources there. And you might be saying, okay, it's a solid blue state, so it's not going to go red no matter what happens. And that argument might technically be true. But the Democratic Party, I think, isn't going to take anything for granted. And the thing is, it looks really bad for you as a party if you're not sending out ads, if you're not doing lit drops, if you're not doing canvassing in a state where your opponent is going all out. A lot of it also has to do with optics. If Democrats can raise money in Maryland, they will raise money and use it. But it might just be a waste of time. And even though the state is more than likely going to go blue, I mean, we're talking about a 99% chance of victory for Democrats, even if Larry Hogan decides to run in the state of Maryland. I mean, it's going to be an exceptional high chance for the Democratic Party to win a re-election with, I believe, Chris Van Hollen in the state of Maryland. I mean, seeing the Republican Party spend so much money and raise so much money, and that's going to happen if Larry Hogan decides to run, the Democrats look bad if they don't spend any money there. And if they leave a safe race up for consistent attacks from the Republican Party, it might actually end up narrowing it down. The thing is, it's a safe race right now. And if Republicans can truly undermine Democrats and get under, all of their campaign methods and all of their infrastructure that they've built within the voting electorate there, they might be able to crack that solid blue characterization that we are used to in the state of Maryland, and potentially for a longer time than just this election. The Democrats can't afford to lose any of their voting blocks across the country, and I think that they will actually spend a lot of money in the state of Maryland, even if everyone close to them is saying that it won't be competitive. And the GOP is looking for exactly that. And I brought up the 2020 elections for a reason. And I mentioned Montana, Kansas, South Carolina, and Kentucky for a reason. Because when you go to websites like Open Secrets, you can actually see the most expensive races from previous election cycles. And I want you to take a look at them. Some of these make sense. Georgia and the Georgia special makes sense. $260 million there. Okay, it was one of the most competitive races, and it actually determined the Senate majority by the end of it. Same thing with that runoff election. Arizona made sense. That was a race that was decided by just a few percentage points. Maine made sense. Maine was a race where the Democrats were really vying to get rid of Susan Collins. While it did end up being an 8-point victory, that was by no means safe, and considering that Susan Collins won in 2014 by 35 points, I would say they did a pretty good job there. Looking at the state of Michigan, absolutely made sense. It was a state where the money from the Senate would have benefited the presidential election, the House elections, and the Senate election there, and it ended up paying off in a race that was seemingly not supposed to be close, but did end up being close. Iowa, you could argue, made sense. It was a swing state, but Republicans ended up winning there. Montana doesn't really make sense. Colorado, typical swing state, makes sense. So Montana at number 9, Kentucky at number 5, and South Carolina at number 2. These 3 races in particular were huge money wasters for the Democratic Party because it did not result in any type of advancement for the Democratic Party. And I say this looking at the margins here. I say this looking at where previous Democrats performed even better than how Democrats did with much more money in 2020. For instance, in the state of Kentucky, the 2016 Senate race was actually closer than this one. Mitch McConnell's 2008 Senate race was just a few percentage points, but only a fraction of the amount of money was spent. The state of Montana re-elected a Democrat in 2018, had a competitive House election that was closer than this, had a competitive governor election that was ending up just as close as this, and seeing that Steve Daines defeated Steve Bullock in the state of Montana as one of the most expensive races with over $80 million spent on the race from both sides, Democrats never really needed to spend this much money because the race was more than likely going to go red from the very beginning. And the state of South Carolina, you have a race where Lindsey Graham ended up winning by 10 points plus. And this race actually was closer in the 2018 governor's race across the state. So seeing the fact that Democrats were able to perform better, and I understand the national circumstances were different, but perform better with a fraction of the money, tells me that maybe spending this much money on a race that never truly was winnable from the beginning was a waste of money. And that money could have been better spent in neighboring South Carolina. Or for the sake of Montana, maybe that money would have been better spent in the state of Iowa. Who knows, right? that raised money could have gone somewhere else because people who tend to donate would have donated to the cause that they truly believe in and thought was electable. And while it may at the time, and polls might have suggested that it was electable in Montana, electable in, states such as South Carolina, realistically it wasn't. And I honestly wouldn't be surprised if polling data came out in the state of Maryland that said Larry Hogan would be able to be competitive in the state. And while it may be a correct poll, it's more than likely not. And I would say that just because of the fact that because Larry Hogan is so popular, people might say, okay, I would vote for Larry Hogan if he decides to run. But once he actually decides to run and he has to take some mainstream/national issues and take them and put them in front of a very Democratic electorate, they will turn on him very quickly. People don't take kind to things like that. The reason why he was elected in 2014 and 2018 was because of the fact that it was a red wave in 2014 and he was extremely popular in 2018. But a governor's race is very different than a Senate race. Determining partisan control and party power is a much bigger thing than a simple governor's race where people will be limiting you with the state legislature and you will just be representing solely your state and not making any type of national votes. At the end of the day, Larry Hogan will have that R by his name, and that makes him non-electable in the state of Maryland. And seeing, though, that, knowing all of this, I still think the Republican Party is pushing forward for this to make the Democratic Party waste money, just as Democrats did in their other races in 2020, when the Republican Party was playing offense. And one could argue that the Republican Party also wasted money, which I do think is true as well. But the point is that, wasting money in all of these races is something that, number one, the Democratic Party, I think, is much more likely to do. They constantly outraise Republicans, but don't really have the same win rate that Republicans do when they outraise Democrats, which is something that needs to be further discussed. I mean, there is a such thing as, running in an unelectable race for the sole purpose of raising money because you're running against an unpopular candidate, but you're not going to win. These are things that need to be discussed. But the main takeaway here is, first of all, that the Democratic Party is much more prone to wasting money in many of these Senate races. And I think the Republican Party, what they're trying to do at least, is put forward races that are not going to be competitive, but make them seem competitive, like the state of Maryland, run an electable candidate in other races, but wouldn't be electable in this one. But Democrats are going to be scared, and they're going to spend a lot of money and resources on a race that they otherwise would have never even touched. I mean, I guarantee you, if Larry Hogan decides not to run in the state of Maryland, that the Maryland Democratic Party won't spend too much money on this race. They might be able to send out a few ads, make it look like they care, but at the end of the day, it's not a prime target for the GOP without Larry Hogan. It isn't a winnable ticket. It isn't a winnable state for the GOP, regardless of who runs, but Democrats might be afraid of Larry Hogan, and that would cost them in other regions across the country. I mean, if money is being spent in Maryland, that's less money being spent in Pennsylvania. If money is being spent in Maryland, that's less money being spent in North Carolina or Georgia or Arizona or Nevada. The Democratic Party has some good news that these same swing states from the 2020 election are rolling over into being swing states in the 2022 midterm elections, which means they already have party offices there. They already have the same type of network and ground game and the same type of apps and reasons and ways of canvassing across the states. But once you start introducing new states that while they may have had a significant advantage in, there probably are more Democratic Party offices in states such as Florida and now Georgia and Arizona than there are in Maryland, or at least there probably will be over the next decade. While Democrats have a lockdown in the state of Maryland, it really doesn't make sense to keep a good amount of Democratic colleagues and support groups in the state of Maryland because it's no longer needed. We know how the state is going to go very consistently, but if Democrats get scared, they might end up wasting money here. And I honestly would not put it past them. I think the GOP will also waste money here. I think that's something that is a valid concern as well. But the Democratic Party needs it more than the GOP does. Republicans have been able to win with less money on a pretty consistent basis a lot of the time. Even Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton out-fundraised Donald Trump in both of his elections, and Donald Trump came extremely close in 2020 and won the election in 2016. And Democrats typically just have some type of fundraising advantage that they have in most competitive races, but they don't always have the win to show for it. So at the end of the day, what we have seen from the Maryland potential candidate, Larry Hogan here, is that while I'm sure he will know in his heart that this race is not winnable, I'm sure many Republicans will know as well. I think the main purpose of him running is to force the Democrats to focus on a race that they would otherwise never focus on. They will be scared by his approval rating. They will look at it and say, maybe he is the one. Maybe Maryland will actually flip for him. I'm telling you now, it's more than likely not going to. I have a lot of confidence in the state of Maryland to vote blue in 2022 simply because of its long electoral history. I could be proven completely wrong. If Larry Hogan decides to run and ends up winning, boom, okay, I was wrong. But I don't think I will be wrong because people have tried to run governors. People have tried to run very popular governors. Ones from the past, ones from the current. They don't typically end up winning because a partisan lean of the state is always the most important thing when assessing a Senate election or any type of nationalized congressional election. And I think that's something that needs to be evaluated and discussed. And while, of course, it shows Larry Hogan will likely not win, Democrats will end up wasting money on this race and consequently could end up losing some extremely competitive races by very narrow amounts that maybe that 10 to 20 million that they might spend on Maryland could have been used there. And that's the Republican Party strategy, at least from what I've gathered so far. So we probably are going to see Mitch McConnell and other Republicans start to pressure Larry Hogan even more. I think that as we begin to reach a point where Democrats are completely with their backs against the wall in states such as Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania, and New Hampshire, and Wisconsin, and North Carolina, and Florida, and Ohio. I mean, right now, the GOP is up in most of these states. And this would be the perfect time to crack down on the Democratic Party to say, you are already pushed up against the wall. You have nowhere left to go. You don't have any states to advance on the GOP besides Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. North Carolina, Ohio, and Florida are very long stretches. And now we are going to crack your solid blue delegation in Maryland or New York or Vermont or Connecticut, this region of the United States, this northeastern region, not necessarily Maryland, but I'm grouping it in for the purpose of just talking about this. You have the West Coast. You have regions of the country the Democrats never even thought were going to be competitive or that they needed to even think about. And they are still failing to take the advantage in those few competitive races. And now the Republican Party is going to try to add one in, and it's going to make the Democratic Party push back even further. They're going to have to immediately divest resources. They're going to have to immediately start. I mean, you already see the media go to the Democratic senator there. Chris Van Hollen was just recently on CNN being questioned about whether or not he would like it if Larry Hogan decided to run against him, what he thought about that type of prospect. You never see the mainstream media go to a safe Dem senator and say, what do you think about potentially losing in your midterm election? You don't see that happening in California. You don't see that happening in the state of Connecticut. You don't see that happening in the state of Washington because it just doesn't seem to be a reality. But the Republicans are trying to make it, and Democrats are going to fall for it, just as they have in many elections in the past. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.